Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Beatrice of Dia's poem, A Lover's Prize. This is a late medieval poem. Beatrice of Dia lives in the late 12th century, from around 1150 to 1200, and she writes in the troubadour tradition. But she is interesting in the troubadour tradition for a couple of different reasons. One, very obviously, is that she's a female poet. And the majority of poets throughout history, but especially prior to, say, the 1920s, the overwhelming majority of poems we have surviving are by male poets. And this was certainly true in the medieval period and in the troubadour tradition, in part because men had better access to education. Men were more likely to have their work sort of written down or remembered, and women's work was much more likely to be forgotten if it was recorded at all. Beatrice of Dia. Beatrice was a countess of Dia in southern France. And so this is part of the reason why she had access to education and why she had the sort of resources to have her work written down, and it happens to survive to today, which is very rare for any piece of medieval writing. But Beatrice's poem, A Lover's Prize, is also interesting because of the way it inverts typical elements of the troubadour or chivalric romance tradition. This is a poem, obviously, about love. A Lover's Prize tells us right off the bat it's about love. But this is a poem that I would say is more sort of straightforward and upfront about what that love means than a lot of troubadour pieces, a lot of chivalric romance pieces, things like this. Partially because she's very straightforward that love is connected to sex. It's connected to physical intimacy and not just emotional affection. So we start out with this opening stanza. I've been in great distress for a knight for whom I longed. I want all future times to know how I loved him to excess. Now I see I am betrayed. He claims I did not give him love. Such was the mistake I made, naked in bed and dressed. So the opening portion of this stanza actually sounds pretty standard for like troubadour songs, troubadour ballads. I've been in great distress for a knight for whom I longed. I want all future times to know how I loved him to excess. This idea of like transcendent love, of almost divine devotion to the beloved is very, very common in this tradition. And the poet persona here, who's not necessarily Beatrice herself, but the poet persona, is capitalizing on this trope, the idealization of the beloved. Now, of course, this is inherently an interesting inversion because typically in troubadour ballads and in chivalric romances, this is the male speaker idealizing the female beloved. Here we have the female speaker idealizing the male beloved. So we've inherently sort of got that inversion, but fundamentally the logic remains the same there. What becomes more striking and really almost more sort of in line with 20th century and 21st century feminism in a way is these last couple of lines in this stanza. Such was the mistake I made, naked in bed and dressed. Now, I'm not as familiar with the troubadour tradition as I am with the chivalric romance tradition, but in chivalric romances, sexuality is often there, but it's often not explicitly dealt with necessarily. Love is treated much more as a sort of ideal, an ideal platonic state almost, that is not rooted in physical intimacy necessarily. I mean, there are instances like in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight where the lady of the castle, whose name escapes me at the moment, comes into Gawain's chamber when he's naked in bed, sleeping, but they don't have sex. She tries, but he refuses her. Here, we have this very clear reference to not just love as emotional state, but love as physical act. And the betrayal of that, both the emotion, I've been in great stress for a knight for whom I longed, but also the betrayal of the physical intimacy. Such was the mistake I made naked in bed and dressed. So we've got the naked in bed, physical intimacy, we've got the dressed, the emotional intimacy, both of which are being betrayed here. In the second stanza, we have some literary allusions to Floris and Blanchefleur, who I don't know specifically, but in the Norton Anthology of World Literature, where I'm reading this poem out of, it just says lovers in a popular medieval romance. So we got literary allusions. This is another element of the troubadour tradition, the chivalric romance tradition. They utilized allusions to recognizable poems, stories, myths, legends, things like this, in order to compare the experience of the poet persona or the subject of the poem to these other well-known tropes. So again, Beatrice is using this very standard technique that a lot of people in this tradition use. Nothing especially interesting or nothing especially unique there. I mean, it's interesting in terms of the troubadour tradition and how knowledge and sets of associations are constructed, but it's not necessarily different from what other poets are doing at this time. But then the third stanza, I think, is again another interesting change to what we typically see. Because we have this definite return to a gendered inversion. Because often in chivalric romances and in troubadour ballads, it is the male poet persona often, or the male hero, seeking the love of the female beloved, the idealized female beloved. Here we have the opposite. But we also have a further gesture at the end of this stanza that I think is really interesting. So the stanza goes like this. Fair, gentle lover, gracious knight, if once I held you as my prize, and lay with you a single night, and gave you a love-laden kiss, my greatest longing is for you to lie there in my husband's place, but only if you promise this, to do all I'd want to do. So the beginning portion of the poem, of the stanza, really interesting. This line, if once I held you as my prize, this is where we get that real clear reference to the inversion of the traditional troubadour tropes, because often in these poems, the female beloved is treated as a prize, a quest object in some sense, kind of the Holy Grail in Arthuriana, for instance. The beloved is treated as the thing to be sought, the prize to be won through contest and struggle. And here we have that inverted. The male beloved is the prize to be won by the female poet persona. And in this case, the way that she wins him is through sex. And I lay with you a single night and gave you a love-laden kiss. But then we get this reference to my greatest longing is for you to lie there in my husband's place. And this is an interesting line because we can, I think, read this two different ways. One is that the poet persona is married to someone else and is having this affair. The other is to marry me, to to occupy the place of my husband in the sense of being my husband. It's interesting that the language of the poem, at least in this translation, opens up both of those options. Either usurp the rightful place of the man who is my husband, or take your rightful place as my husband. In a way, the first is maybe more feminist, in that it involves the female poet persona making her own decisions about her sexuality and her body. The second is probably more conventional, and therefore maybe more right in terms of reading this as a 12th century poem. But this sort of idea that I had sex with you, now you have to marry me, is one way of reading this. But then the last bit, I think, really sort of gives it an additional twist, this last line. But only if you promise this, to do all I'd want to do. What does this mean exactly? Well, so part of it is, it depends on how exactly we read the grammar of the sentence, right? Because if the sort of operative phrase is, I want you to lie there in my husband's place, but only if you promise to do all I'll want to do, then we can read this as, I want us to be married, but you have to obey me. You have to be subservient to me. You have to submit to me, whatever it is. And again, very feminist. I'm on board with this. So if we think about this in terms of, I want us to get married, and I want the premise of our marriage to be that I am in charge, that's one reading of this. We can also read this, to lie there in my husband's place, but only if you promise to do what I want. We can have sex again, but only if I get to decide how we have sex. So this is, again, I'd say a very feminist approach, but this is less in the sort of traditional chivalric romantic tradition in which marriage and the sort of lifelong commitment to the beloved are central. This is more in the sort of level of the mistakes made naked than the mistakes made dressed. This idea that I want to be in charge of our sexual life is, I think, a valid reading of this, depending on how we understand the grammar of this sentence. But then we've also got this other phrase at the beginning of it. My greatest longing is for you, to lie there in my husband's place, but only if you promise this, to do all I'd want to do. If we read this sentence that way, with the emphasis on my greatest longing is, but only if, then the longing is less for the beloved and more for the experience of love. Again, both probably emotional and physical. And so ultimately what I think is most striking about this poem is this intertwining of physical and emotional love in a way that complicates the traditional troubadour and chivalric romance traditions that are more likely to be somewhat demure about sexuality, and to focus on, because this is one of the great things that comes out of the chivalric and the troubadour traditions, right, is this idea of idealized love, this almost Disney type eternal love where the beloved is idealized, etc., etc. And Beatrice of Dia is challenging that in some ways by sort of being very upfront that love is inherently, romantic love is inherently on some level linked to sexuality, and sexuality is inherently on some level linked to power.